Hi, welcome to the Tales of TIC podcast. Today, I'm lucky to be joined by a very special guest. I would like to introduce Dr. Kris Hansen. Kris, thank you for joining today. Kris has had a very successful career with over 25 years in the environmental testing industry. Over 20 years of that being at 3M with various operational leader titles before actually starting her own firm, Savannah Science Company. So yeah, Kris, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks for inviting me. I'm glad to be here.
No, absolutely. I'm sure it'll be a great podcast. And I know many people have, been listening to your story over the last few weeks, if not longer, and, would be very interested to hear what you have to say. So I suppose, without matter of ado, let's jump into it. So, Kris, can you please provide an overview of your career journey and how you got started within the environmental testing sector?
Sure. I grew up in Minnesota in the U.S. and was always a kid that liked to be outside playing around. And I think that led me when I got into college and started to take some science classes. I decided to do environmental chemistry because it was just a passion of mine to do something outside and to explore natural phenomena. I had the opportunity to do an independent research project when I was in college that was really influential because it allowed me to use science in a way that was practical and important to me. I studied some PCB pollution in a local river near the college that I attended. And as a result of the work that myself and my research advisor did, we were able to identify a source of influx of PCBs into the river and get that spot designated as a Superfund site, so it got cleaned up. So it was very impactful for me.
No, certainly.
I went to graduate school in Colorado and continued to do environmental chemistry, this time focusing on the atmosphere, specifically looking at some pollutants in the lower atmosphere. And after I got my PhD, I went to 3M and started working in their environmental lab, where I spent several years studying, among other things, PFAS. So I think that kind of brings us up to the topic of interest today.
Yes, certainly. And I suppose before we go on too much further, correct me if I'm wrong, did your father actually work at 3M? And would you say he was a driving force behind you going into the industry, or was it just your curiosity being outside, as you've already said?
Yeah, I mean, if anything, my father was a reason why I didn't want to work at 3M. I loved him and respected him, but, I didn't really want to follow so closely in my father's footsteps. He was an engineer. He ended up inventing a lot of really fantastic products for 3M and had a very good career. But as a chemist, he and I went different directions within the company.
Okay, for sure. And as you said, that sort of leads on to the main talking point today. So, as I addressed briefly, your story came to light recently due to events that occurred at 3M early in your career. So, I mean, Kris, if you wouldn't mind, can you briefly explain, we'll call it the infamous PFAS situation that occurred while you were at 3M?
Yeah. So I joined 3M in 1997 and I was 28 years old. And I think that's significant just because I was a young woman in a very large company that had a lot of much more senior, much more male scientists around. After I'd been there for about a year, my boss asked me to look into an interferent that was coming up in an analysis of some blood samples that we had. And so I did some work with my team. I had a good team of folks that I worked with, and we determined that the interferent that was in the method was actually PFOS, perfluorooctane sulfonate, which is a forever chemical, one of many, many. But 3M was pretty much the world's sole producer of that chemical. And we found it in blood samples from the general population. And so, of course, we did all the kinds of things that you should do to verify the data that you have with such a sensitive topic, and really convinced ourselves that this was actually a significant contamination in the blood of the general population. I shared that information with my boss, who actually left the company within a very short time of hearing that information. Within the company, of course, it was a very stressful, significant finding, and there were some questions about the science that we worked to address. But maybe more significant to me, there started to be a lot of questions about me, pushback on the work, pushback on my motivations. We worked continually for several months to try and demonstrate that we did see fluorochemical contamination of the general population. And even before we had completely put that question to bed for everybody at 3M, we discovered that fluorochemicals were, in fact, widely distributed in the environment and in the food chain. So sort of the story from 3M's perspective just got worse and worse. And for me, as the scientist who was leading this effort, again, being a young woman in a big corporation, it was very challenging. And I did not feel supported in the work that I was doing, and felt that there was a lot of effort to try and intimidate me and push me off what I was doing. Nearly a year after I made the discovery of the fluorochemical, I ran across another scientist who I had approached to help me out with something. And he told me something that knocked the wind out of me. He said, "I don't know why everyone is making such a big deal about this. We knew about this contamination 25 years ago." And that was really a kind of an awful feeling, to understand that the company had not only contaminated the entire globe with their chemicals, but they had actually known about it over 20 years earlier. And when I brought that information back to my boss, I got no response. And things just went on as normal. I continued to do my work. My team and we identified eventually about 15 fluorochemicals in the blood of the general population, which I now understand people have found hundreds, but we found 15. And again, we found more evidence of it being widely distributed in the environment and in the food chain. I had the opportunity to share those results with the CEO of 3M. And again, 3M is a multi-billion-dollar company with the most important men in the company in the room at the time, and was attacked for doing the science. Very aggressive questioning about me and what I had done, and a very unpleasant experience. About a year after that meeting with the CEO, 3M made the decision to exit the C8 fluorochemical business, which for me was a huge success. We had found this contaminant and 3M was going to get out of the business. But I was also very exhausted by the whole experience. So within less than a year after that announcement, I left the environmental lab. And only recently, really in the last 2 years, became aware of all of the really frightening health effects associated with fluorochemicals. And in fact, becoming more aware of how much data 3M had amassed in the 25 years prior to what I considered to be a discovery, but was in fact something that quite likely the company had known about for decades.
Yeah, I think that is amazing, actually, the fact that, this was a groundbreaking discovery from yourself, and it had actually been, I suppose, kept on the down low for 25 years, a long time. Mm-hmm. And I mean, you've touched on quite a large topic there, in the sense of, I suppose, science being manipulated, undone science, I suppose, people seeing what they want to see, hearing what they want to hear. Do you believe, there are, I suppose, still ways that science can be manipulated, influenced within the environmental sector?
Yeah. Absolutely. I think that we see it all the time. And for me at the time, and even in going back over 3M's record, I naively assumed that my experience was unique. And I since have talked to a lot of really smart people who study these things. And it turns out that there's playbooks that industry follows to not ask the questions that are going to be negative and are going to hurt their objectives with respect to profits. And there is, systemic use of this idea of doing a study and then sharing the data that supports your profits and hiding the data that doesn't. And I think that's true really throughout the technical industries, whether it's environmental science or not, but it is certainly the case. And we've seen it with other companies with respect to climate change and pesticides and herbicides for sure.
No, certainly. I do agree. It is a shame that I suppose it happens like that, and people do prioritize, profits over, I suppose, sharing the true results. But I suppose, that's the industry, and that's the world we live in. So I suppose moving on from there, we did talk about, you had a long career at 3M, initially starting in the lab, moving out, and, you have proven yourself as a strong leader within the industry. I mean, how would you, I suppose, define operational excellence, particularly, in today's market?
I think it's exciting to see the area, particularly of environmental science, really grow. And what I see as operational excellence in the field is the ability to do good science and to be very explicit about defining the limits of the science. So, for example, if somebody says that compound is not present, and the discussion ends there, that's not operational excellence. We really need to use the data responsibly and say it's not present above my current detection limit of whatever it may be. So as scientists, being careful to define and understand the limits of the data, I think allows it to be used effectively or more effectively by policymakers, by citizens, and by industry. And so that careful attention to detail and that careful communication of the limits of the data that we collect is imperative for the field.
No, I think it certainly is. And you touched on something quite interesting there, where you mentioned, I suppose, the results are only as far as you can see the detection levels. And I imagine you have a great answer for what I'm going to mention. But how has the industry actually changed since you started, and what direction do you actually see the industry going?
I think there's been a couple of really huge changes to the industry that make it more powerful and more exciting. And the first is simply the analytical instrumentation, the level to which we can see things in very complicated matrices, and the level of certainty that we can apply to say that is what I think it is really exciting. It's taken a lot of the uncertainty out of the equation that, back in the 70s and 80s, and certainly even, in the early 2000s, there's a lot more certainty and a lot more availability of analytical tools, and the ability to take those tools into the field, to move them and bring them where there is a problem. I think the other thing that's really exciting is our ability to collect and compile huge data sets. So scientists can collaborate, all over the world to bring in millions of data points and then do a statistical analysis that allows us to see relationships that would never be clear if we were limited by the amount of data that one person or one lab could collect. So those data collection and statistical methods that we have now in huge data sets are, I think, really, really an exciting frontier.
No, certainly. And I suppose, technology has developed a lot in terms of instrumentation over, the last 20 plus years. But I suppose from my perspective, I imagine, there's only so far that, we can push technology and the accuracy and precision that, these instruments can tell. And as I said, the levels we can develop them to. Where would you say, I suppose, the next area is that the industry can grow and develop in order to improve and keep kicking on in the levels that it has from instrumentation improvements?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we have really learned is the value of collaboration, and not just collaboration with other people who are doing analytical chemistry in the environment, but collaboration with people in adjacent fields. And that has always been a part of environmental analysis, but I think now more so, even beyond the science, where an analytical chemist in collaboration with an epidemiologist or a toxicologist or a hydrologist, that's a very powerful combination. But I also think there are a really powerful potential for collaboration with things like journalists who are out in the world noticing things and listening to people and hearing things that a scientist may not be aware of. And if that journalist can say, this is going on and people don't understand it, or it's important, and really understand the human part of the problem, I think there's a really exciting opportunity for collaboration there, be it with a journalist or a city planner or a city leader, or just the community that you're in. That potential for impactful science to come from some unusual collaborations that's what I find really intriguing and exciting.
Sure. Do you feel that that's realistic? Do you think collaboration between journalists, scientists is something that we'll see in the next few years? Or is it, have you noticed it already occurring?
Yeah, for sure. I think it, I mean, in this, for me personally, just in having my story become more known, which is thanks to a wonderful journalist. But beyond that, I've had a lot of journalists reach out to me and ask for, hey, we're doing something, we're doing a study here, we're trying to figure things out. We could use your input as a scientist. So, and I know for sure I'm not the first one. There are a lot of scientists, I think, who are passionate about reaching out to non-scientists and recognizing the power of that collaboration that can be leveraged for change.
No, that's great. That is great. And I suppose looking at, where the industry is going, and I suppose the next generation of scientists coming into the industry, I mean, what advice would you give those wanting to start a career in the industry, maybe possible routes once they arrive there?
I mean, first thing for anyone starting a career is to follow your passion, right? You have to do something that you care about and that you're interested in. And I think that's pretty generic advice, but I also think it's pretty important because every person goes through really hard times. And I think it's that passion and your belief in what you're doing that allows you to get through that. Specifically with respect to a career in environmental science, I think the idea of developing communication skills is something that is often overlooked. So in addition to developing skills as a scientist, developing skills as a communicator is going to make your work more impactful, and it's going to open up lots of opportunities for collaboration. One of the things I hate is when people ask scientists to, quote, dumb it down for the population. And it's not dumbing it down, right? Scientists have a language that we've developed, and it's full of acronyms and rules that non-scientists haven't learned. Why would they? And so for me as a scientist to talk about what I'm doing in a language that is accessible to a non-scientist, that's not dumbing it down. It's just making it accessible. And I think it's a skill that scientists really could devote more time to mastering because it's important, right? If you figure something out that can have an impact, if you can't communicate it clearly to people, then that conclusion lives and dies with you.
What I suppose on that perspective, I mean, maybe it's a science from, I suppose, advice to scientists, or maybe how do you see them improving that skill? Do you think it's coming from maybe an adjacent industry, if we're looking at environmental testing, or maybe just in an industry outside of, the typical scientific realm, where they will improve that communication skills and actually be able to collaborate with people rather than dumbing it down?
Yeah, for me, I was lucky. I went to a liberal arts college for my undergraduate degree, and I happened to take a lot of English courses and with a lot of reading and writing, and I learned how to do that in college. I certainly have interfaced with a lot of scientists who cannot write and cannot speak, and so I think it becomes part of, once you're in the industry, if you miss that step in your education, continuing education about how to write and how to speak clearly, most companies will offer some kind of a budget for people to continue to develop their skills. And I think that getting some formal training is important. And I also think, you can practice, right? You can talk to people and take something that is that's important to you as a scientist and explain it to a friend of yours who's a non-scientist, and work on translating that technical jargon that we fall back on into something that makes that science accessible and compelling to a non-scientist.
Sure. And I suppose, from your position where you are now at Savannah Science and at the, later years in 3M, have you seen a keen interest from young kids looking to get into science, looking to get into the environmental testing sector? Is that something you've seen? Do you think it's promising? And I suppose to jump onto that, I mean, what do you think the promising aspect is of the environmental testing space right now? Is it PFAS, which is having a lot more regulation, or do you think there's possibly something else further down the line?
Yeah, I'm really excited about what I see in young people. I have 3 children, all of whom are in their early 20s, and they and their friends, it is a generation, I think, that is sort of realizing the importance of understanding and caring for the environment. And so I see a generation that has more passion for doing something good that makes a difference than I have seen in previous generations. And I think it's a group that cares a lot about the environment, whether it's PFAS or whether it's climate change. I think there's a lot of momentum, not just in the US, but globally, to really try and work for solutions that are going to be necessary for us to continue with life on Earth. So I love seeing that in young people. I get questions all the time, and I see that passion about people who are like, I want to get in and make a difference. And I'm very excited about that.
No, I mean, what a perfect way, I suppose, to finish the podcast. What great closing statements. Yeah, I think the industry still looks strong. As I said, there's a lot of exciting stuff happening. It looks like, there is a keen interest from, younger individuals. So, I mean, Kris, thank you so much for your time. It was great learning of your story, hearing your industry insights, and I suppose, giving advice to those looking to get in the industry, or not even just from college, even if it's people coming across from, if it's, pharmaceuticals, pharma, just a general scientific background, maybe looking to progress in. I'm sure you've possibly convinced a few other people, maybe dissuaded a few others as well. Who knows? But no, I really appreciate your time. So it was great having you. And yeah, to everyone watching, please stay tuned for, I suppose, more podcasts like Kris and more exciting stories. So yeah, thank you, Kris.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.